Hey guys, welcome to an interview with the Cornell Policy Group. My name is Jaiden Fisher-Dayn. I'm the Director of Internal Affairs at the Cornell Policy Group. And today with me, I have Tom Allon. He's the co-founder of the Five Borough Institute, the publisher of City and State, and a fellow Cornell alum. Hello, Tom.
Nice to see you. Also a former mayoral candidate.
That's right, former New York City mayoral candidate. Is it in 2013, right?
2013, yeah, yep.
Wow, wow,
I
awesome.
was I was a Liberal Party backed candidate.
That's awesome. Well, that fits right into what we're going to talk about. As we know, election day is a couple of days away, and we have a Democratic primary mayoral race that is, getting across the whole country. Everyone's talking about it. I have people out of state texting me. Um, there's a big race here, and the front runners are former Governor Andrew Cuomo and Democratic Socialist Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani. Really a fascinating race. And Tom, I wanted to talk about some of their policy proposals and then just spark a conversation about what you think and how that play out in New York City.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Just to your point about this being sort of a national issue, I've been texting this morning with a friend of mine who's a congressman in Philadelphia. So, and he says, "What's going on with your crazy mayoral race?" And he knew a lot about it. So, yeah, people are talking about it.
Yeah. So I think the first big issue New Yorkers have on their mind is the housing crisis.
Yep,
Um, Housing is just not affordable. Rents have gone up under the Adams administration.
yep,
But everything just feels so expensive, no matter who you are. If you're low income, middle class, and even at the top, people just feel like they're being
yep.
priced out of New York City.
hmm
And you have two candidates, or there are more candidates, but the top two candidates have very different proposals for how to deal with the housing crisis. Zoran Mamdani is running on let's freeze the rent for all rent stabilized apartments. They've seen their rent go up by 9% over the Adams administration. And that's in line with most of the other candidates. I think on the debate stage, almost every candidate said that they would endorse a rent freeze in year one, except for Andrew Cuomo, who kind of deflected the answer, but he has a very different idea of how to deal with rent prices. Um, Rent freeze is such a, maybe even controversial topic in New York City. Why is that? And what are these two different proposals here?
So let me just take a step back and tell you. New York City is one of the few places in the country that has still a large percentage of its rental units as regulated, right? There's rent control and rent stabilization. I am a product of rent-controlled apartments. My parents were immigrants that came here in 1956 and moved into a two-bedroom on the Upper West Side, which then they were paying $400 or $500 a month for. That apartment's worth $2.5 million now. So I speak about this from as someone who benefited from it. I do think that first of all, I think Zoran, there's an old saying that Mario Cuomo said, Andrew's father, that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. And so, when you're running for office, it's a very different skill set than actually governing, right? And Zoran has a very clear, consistent message, similar to de Blasio's back in 2013. His was a tale of two cities, and how he was going to change that. And Zoran's is a variation on that theme that we need to freeze the rent, we need to make universal daycare, free, buses free, supermarkets that are city subsidized, free cheese for everybody. That everybody understands what he's saying. Um, so first of all, I think it's more realistic in the long term to have modest increases in the rent that 1 million units in New York, I think it affects probably 2 million people. So clearly there's a lot of votes in that community, and to say you're going to freeze people's rent is a smart thing to say. However, in practicality, there's a lot of those building owners, and they're usually small building owners, who've either had to abandon their buildings or neglect them, or or warehouse apartments because they have not their costs have exceeded their the rent rolls. I have a very different view. I mean, again, I'm not running for mayor this time, but I believe, and I believe this is true. This should be true for a lot of um, what do they call it? Things that people get like Medicare, Medicaid.
Hmm.
Uh, I think things should. I think something like subsidies of rent or regulated rent. Everything should be means tested.
Mm,
Meaning, when you applied to college at Cornell, when I applied to college at Cornell, they looked at my family's net worth, they looked at my father's income, my mother's income, and they came up with a financial aid package for me, right? So I was able to get both scholarships and loans to go to Cornell back in 1980 through 84.
mm,
Um, if you live in a rent stabilized or rent controlled apartment in New York City, you could have a second home somewhere. You could be worth $10 million, but you still get that subsidized rent, if you will. And I think that's the flaw in the system. And I think that's partially why rents are so high in the rest of the city because it's a distorted market.
mm.
So landlords that are being underpaid for the rent regulated units have to make up for that in the other units they rent. And that's why they're charging, I have a child who's paying $4,500 for a studio in New York, one of my children. Now it's in a beautiful building with amenities and a pool and all that kind of stuff, but still, that's a crazy amount of money to spend for a studio.
Yeah, yeah,
So I think, again, I think Andrew Cuomo, who is closer, obviously, to the real estate community, his plan is more realistic. I think Eric Adams's plan was more realistic. The 9%, 9% in 4 years, or of increases sounds like a lot, but that's a little more than 2% a year. If you're paying $2,000 for a rent regulated units, let's look at the math, and it goes up 9% over 4 years, you're basically paying $180 more, right, per month, which is, we're talking about 40 some $45 a year more. It's a it's a lot of money to some people, or certainly more money. But when you think that inflation was 9% 3 years ago, and inflation is now down to 2 or 3%, you know, costs are going up, and
yeah,
landlords have to figure out how to pay for the upkeep of buildings, gas, electricity, water, all those things. So it's not quite fair to say that you're going to freeze the rents because you're going to have a situation eventually, if you do that every year, where landlords will abandon buildings like they did in the 1970s, and that's not good for everybody.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's the common argument, back against the rent freeze and against Zoran's housing proposal here.
Mhm.
Now let me just push back a little bit as what I would imagine Zoran would respond.
Sure.
He would say, look, the median income of those living in rent stabilized apartments is $60,000 a year. $60,000 a year is, knowing the cost of New York, is really hard to live in New York.
Sure.
And I think he also claims that most of the tenants are making, I'm not sorry, not most of the landlords are those making profits on these rent stabilized homes. And that if there are landlords who aren't making profits, he is, and I think he said this on your podcast, when he interviewed, he's committed to keeping the program, where landlords can show their books and then be accommodated for adjusted increases within the rents. And I think there are two other alleyways.
That's a
Yeah,
smart way of doing it because, again, I think the burden shouldn't, because these people have low median incomes, it shouldn't be the burden on their landlords. But if government wants to take a more proactive role and either give vouchers to those, as I said, who are means tested, who qualify to
mm,
then pay their landlords, the additional rent, or to pay directly to the landlord some subsidy if they've showed them their books and their profit level is low or non-existent. But yeah, I think I think there needs to be some sort of compromise
yeah,
where the landlords don't suffer the burden of having, people living in their homes who can't make the rents.
yeah, yeah. And from your understanding, is Cuomo endorsing a rent freeze at all? I mean, I know he deflected the answer during the debate. What
I'd,
what's
I'd,
what's really his?
I'd be surprised if he would endorse something like that. Again, I think he's smart to probably, try to sidestep it as much as possible because, again, you have a million rent regulated units. Let's say there's 2 million
It's about 2 million people. Yeah.
2 million people. You got to think that at least I'd say at least a third of those people vote or a quarter of those people vote,
Yeah,
and so, that's a pretty big population that's of course is going to be they may not be single interest voters, but if one guy is going to save me, $50 a year, $100 a year on my rent, 100 per month on my rent, then I'll probably go with that guy.
yeah, for sure, for sure. And then, so let's transition. There's this other part of the housing argument that's not about the freeze, but about how are we going to build more houses in New York City? Because ultimately, that's one way that costs are going to go down. If we increase supply. And there's again, I think Zoran's campaign is focused on how could we make public goods excellent, right? And so what he's saying, I want to increase housing by 200,000 affordable units through the public sector, though. And Andrew Cuomo's saying, I want to build 500,000 units, but a portion of that is affordable. So it's roughly about the same amount of affordable housing units, but he wants to do that through tax incentives, really bringing in the private sector. And I think over time, Zoran's been more susceptible to admitting that the private sector has a role in building housing, but his housing is really focused on how can the public sector excel in providing these goods for New Yorkers. So again, it's two very different outlooks on how to increase supply. What's your thoughts on that?
So first of all, again, I'm going to go back to that phrase that I used before. You campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. Zelnor Myri says he's going to build 1 million units over the next 10
Yeah,
years. Like,
exactly.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's like this, arms race where it's like, you can building housing in New York is very difficult.
yeah,
There's a very onerous approval process called ULURP. There's the most expensive construction of housing in America, if not the world. And then you're contending with NIMBYs and people that don't want housing.
yeah,
My belief about housing is, and I agree with both Cuomo and Zoran's plans, is it's not an either or, it's an and, right? So we got to throw all at the wall to get housing, more housing. So one idea that came out in the campaign that got very little attention was something that Brad Lander put out in a report, which I actually suggested to him 5 months ago, 6 months ago, and I'm glad he listened to me. And it's called home sharing. So there are 1 million, roughly 1 million spare bedrooms in New York City, in the five boroughs that are not being used.
hmm,
Know about your family's home, but if your parents have a three-bedroom and you move out of the house after college, then they got one bedrooms free. Not everybody's going to want to rent that bedroom out, but there is a large percentage or a decent percentage of people in the city. I think largely the elderly who, if they have an extra one or two bedrooms, from a financial standpoint, it makes sense for them to rent out that
yeah,
bedroom. From a loneliness and a companionship standpoint, it stands to reason that they want to rent out that bedroom. But New York makes it very difficult to do that. New York, like many cities, says you can't put a lock on a bedroom in your apartment, or you can't rent out a room, for zoning
yeah,
reasons. So I believe, this is again, to use Obama's phrase, there's the fierce urgency of now, right? Because these plans that Cuomo puts out, Zoran puts out, Zellner puts out, these are 5, 10 year plans. But
yeah, exactly.
there's people right now who are either leaving New York or having a hard time living in New York, or paying 50% of their income to their rent, or to their mortgage and maintenance. And so I think you need to come up with some very short-term idea like that, which could unlock, say, 50 to 100,000 units right away, maybe more, right? Um, you have to do quick sort of like conversions of commercial buildings to residential housing.
Yeah,
My think tank put out a report that recommended that the city do something called flexible co-living. So kind of almost dorm-like living. One of the difficulties in converting commercial real estate to residential real estate is that it's not a cheap process, because you have plumbing issues, right? Because you have to have bathrooms in every apartment, and you have to have, kitchens. And then there's also the issue of interior light space. In New York City, it's illegal to have an apartment with no windows.
yeah,
So, but if you did flexible co-living, and we put out a report that had architectural renderings and examples, you then could, again, use kind of the dorm-like sort of example, or what used to be called SROs in New York, single room occupancy rooms or dwellings, and you could have 12 apartment, people having their own room on a floor, and then there's a kitchen and a bathroom, a shared kitchen and bathrooms
Yeah,
at the end. That would create a lot of units very quickly.
yeah,
Again, th those conversions can happen in a year or two as opposed to 5 years, for some of these residential conversions. So I think again, we need to come up with short-term creative solutions like that. Um, and then listen, I think people like Scott Stringer and others have put out ideas of using unused land. There's neighborhoods that can be convert, that can be, this is what I think Brad Landman did in Gowanus was very
yeah.
creative and smart. There's other areas of New York. I think Brad Lander's idea of taking four of the 12 municipal golf courses and using them
Golf
for
course. Yeah,
also. So I think it's like, again, I think Zoran has an idea, Andrew has an idea, Scott Stringer has an idea. Throw all those things into a basket and try to execute as many of them as you can.
exactly.
Because if you sincerely think this is a crisis, which I believe it is, then it needs the fierce urgency of now, and you have to do it on multiple fronts.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of what you're saying, and this is one thing I think a lot of candidates agree on, um, is that there are so many boundaries to creating supply, and not just with housing, but there's all these red lines, and it's something, and I think it goes to this book Abundance that just came out,
Yeah.
which is it's kind of dominating like the political housing world. I know one of my good friends, big fan of that book, and it's also something you ask every candidate on the podcast. Um, this what needs to be done, right? Like we have so many regulations. How do we cut all the red tape to start, improving government efficiency?
Listen, going back, I think it's over 100 years, the Empire State Building got built in 1 year.
Yeah, and that's something it's something that Zelnor is
Talked
frequently
about.
referencing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, New York in the late 1800s, early 1900s did big, great things. Built Grand Central Terminal, built Penn Station, built, highways, roads. It's not just New York, but America in general has kind of like not been doing big things like it did. So there has to be a real, you almost have to throw out all the regulations that you have now and come up with, start from scratch on some
Mm,
level. And there has to be more. I mean, listen, I think the book Abundance and I think this housing crisis we have, I think has changed the paradigm even for left-wing politicians that, because left-wing politicians in the past would have said like, no, I don't want that building in my, it has to be 100% affordable. I don't want it at all. And there's been a lot more compromise by uh, Democrats on the left about that. So I think everybody at least is on the same page that there's a need to build and need to do more.
yeah, yeah,
Again, it's you have to figure out how to, the city of yes, I think is a good example of a good idea that was executed relatively quickly. I think it'll unlock a lot of neighbors. You know, Hochul had a good idea in the budget 2 years ago that she ended up having to cave on of building, of changing zoning around train stations around New York State. Got pushed back in the suburbs in Long Island and Westchester, so she abandoned it. But those are the kind of things we need. I mean, we have to build around, like, that's the thing too, like building around subway stations, their zoning has to change.
yeah,
One of the things I recommended when I ran for mayor 12 years ago, the city owns, I think it's about 1,000 school buildings in the city. You know, not all 1,000 of them are in great neighborhoods or places where people want to build, but there's at least, two, three, 400 schools where you could sell the air rights above the schools. And you could then build a new modern building. Obviously the school would have to go somewhere else for 2 years or whatever, but then you can have a modern school built at the same time because our school buildings are also 19th century structures and not keeping pace with 21st century demands. And you have to come up with creative ideas like that. Those are the kind of things that I think will unlock a lot of value and a lot of and allow things like abundance to happen.
yeah, yeah. There's no doubt that that's a central concern.
Mhm.
I think in Ezra Klein's most recent opinion piece, he really applauds Brad Lander,
Yes.
especially with the Gowanus project that he's been working on,
Yeah.
has been working on, and then also says that he's liked what he's heard recently from Zoran in terms of this abundance idea and some of the arguments that he's been waiting for a long time the left to make. So I thought that was in the mix of all the New York Times chaos. I thought that those were two nice shout outs in the Klein piece.
Yeah, listen, I mean, Brad had a very good week. I mean, he hasn't officially gotten the New York Times endorsement, but in every
Kind
way,
of.
in every other
Yeah.
way, he's gotten it. Again, we discussed before, it's too little, too late. It seems like
Yeah.
for his campaign. I mean, I think it may have solidified his position in third place, and he'll
Yeah.
probably instead of getting 8% or 10% of the vote in the first round, he'll probably get 15 to 70% is my guess. But I mean, and listen, somebody said to me the other day, when Zoran and Brad Lander cross-endorsed, someone was like, "Oh, does that mean maybe Brad Lander will be his first deputy mayor if he wins?" That would make me feel a lot better about Zoran if he had somebody
Yeah.
smart as first deputy mayor. Maybe,
Yeah,
maybe.
I saw a great article about that. I forget who wrote it, but just with the amount of experience that Lander has and the kind of he doesn't have the charisma, but he has the brains.
Yeah,
That
I
that
mean,
that could be an interesting position.
Brad's a very smart guy. He's going to be out of a job probably on, January 1st, 2026. I
Mm,
don't know whether being a deputy mayor is something that is of interest to him, but if he truly wants to help the city, he could have a lot of power there.
yeah, for sure. I want to shift our conversation to
I don't think Cuomo's going to hire him if Cuomo's the mayor.
no, no. But yeah, I want to shift our conversation to kind of the second topic in which I feel is pressing New Yorkers, and that's public safety.
Mhm.
Um, whether or not crime is going down or not in terms of the numbers, New Yorkers just have this feeling, or what I've heard is that there's this feeling that people are unsafe.
Hmm.
And again, there's two very different proposals here among Zoran and Andrew Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo says we need to hire police. And he's ambitious with that. He wants to hire more police than any other candidate. I think it's 5,000 new police officers. He wants to increase the amount of police officers in the subway stations. And when I'm reading his policy, to me, it sounds like he wants to address public safety through increased enforcement, whether that be figuring out how to redesign the turnstiles that make it, less easy to jump, or he says like transit is only for transit. If that's removing, homeless people from the train stations, it sounds like it's going through. He's going the enforcement route.
Yep.
And on the other side, Zoran Mamdani's taking a different approach. He's released his Department of Community Safety, which aims to address hate crimes, gun violence, subway safety, homelessness through not non-enforcement means, through kind of root cause approaches. I think that's what we would say at school. This is how you address crime through its root causes, figuring out how we can, give people the mental health advice and people that they need. I think one of his ideas that I heard on your podcast is he wants to convert the vacant newsstands in subway stations into kind of quick health hubs for people in need. Um, so yeah, it's two very different plans. One's a more, I think, restorative justice, root cause approach. Another is we need more enforcement in New York City.
Hmm.
What
Hmm.
what do you think about that? And what's the right what do you think is the approach to fixing public safety?
Yeah, I hate to be repetitive, but I think again, it's not an either or.
Yeah,
It's a yes and. Um, Listen, I wrote a column 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago, when the subway crime was going up quite a bit. I suggested that the mayor deploy one cop on every subway on the actual subway,
yeah,
patrolling up and down, walking up and down the cars like they used to back in the 1980s and 1970s. Um, Eric Adams liked that idea, and now it's 24/7. And then he got pushback from the PBA president, Patrick Lynch, saying it's too dangerous. There needs to be two at the same time. With two, it becomes, then it becomes like, 5,000 cops, or I forgot what the number you would need. It becomes maybe a little bit more difficult to do that. But I think, and I think it might have been Hochul's idea, but I think it's being done through the New York City Police Force. There are cops overnight on the subways
at
now.
night, yeah,
At
yeah,
night. Now,
and
I don't know. I don't ride the subway much after 10 or 11 o'clock like I used to. I haven't seen them. I don't know whether they're patrolling up and down or how effective they are. But I spoke to Jana Lieber once, the head of the MTA, and he said 45% of crimes in the subway system happen on the subway cars.
Hmm.
So having more of a presence there, I think Andrew Cuomo is right. Um, what Zoran is suggesting, the Department of Community, what was it, Community Safety,
Community safety. Yeah.
is not dissimilar from what Eric Adams implemented 2 years ago, where he has street teams working, mental health people along with public safety people, trying to get people off the street or off the subways. I recently spoke to Eric about it. I think he said they've gotten 2,000 people off the street and subways over the past 2 years into safer places.
Mm.
That's again not a so what Zoran's recommending is maybe a different administrative way of looking at it, and it's maybe slightly semantic. I mean, I do agree with him in the sense that cops should not be responding to mental health crises or
Yeah.
people exhibiting mental health problems either in subways or in their homes or anywhere. I think and I think most cops would agree with that. I do think, one of the problems we have in New York also is that we don't even have as many police as we're budgeted to have because they've been leaving in droves. Policing in New York has become less remunerative than it is in the suburbs or in other states. It's not, it's a dangerous job, more dangerous than it is in, let's say, the Hamptons, where you can make more money. So I think we have to figure out a way. I mean, I think if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Eric Adams and Jessica Tisch who recently said that you don't need to have I think full 4 year college degree, or you can be younger and apply to become part of the police force. Um, but Cuomo's right. We need to get back to our capacity of police. I think we're at 32,000, and I think we're budgeted for 30, close to 34. I think at one point in Bloomberg administration, there was as many as 41,000 cops. That's not necessarily the answer. But again, it's an and situation. And I do like some of Zoran's ideas around. I mean, I believe in restorative justice. Not. I've always been of the belief too that people that commit nonviolent crimes should be fined a significant
Mm.
amount of money, and there should be punitive damages that way, through money, and there should be a very aggressive way of collecting that money, even if it then turns into community service, if the person isn't able to pay the full fine. Listen, if you jump a turnstile or get on a bus and don't pay, and you're caught, maybe the first time you're basically given a free pass or a $50 fine. But if you do that like 5 times, then you should be fined a significant amount of money, $500, whatever the number is, that's painful enough that
Mm.
you do it again. Um, that's how they do it. That's how they did it in Europe when I was young, when I lived there. And that's, I think, also part of the paradigm that can change. We don't need to arrest people. We don't need to put them in jail for non-violent crimes. But we do have to, if they're shoplifting, if they're jumping turnstiles, if they're going on buses for free, there is a sense of disorder in New York. And I'm afraid someone like Zoran Mamdani, that disorder will not get better, might even possibly get worse. So I think we have to find sort of a balance. It's
Yeah.
very demoralizing to walk into a CVS and to buy toothpaste and ask the guy at the front desk to come over and unlock the window where the toothpaste is held. That's not in New York I want to live in, and I don't think
Of course. Of
anybody
course. Now, so I think there's again, like you said, there needs to be some kind of middle here. Um, Now, like you mentioned Bloomberg, and I think Bloomberg with policing is a good example of, policing may have ended up hurting a lot of New York City communities. I mean, he employed the stop and frisk policy, which is really detrimental to New York communities of color as well. And I think that's a concern of increasing, enforcement to an extent. Like you said, Andrew Cuomo wants to increase by 5,000. Brad Lander, I think, is less. Is it 3,000 possibly? I could have that number wrong. Um,
That's right.
but there's varying, and of course Zoran is not defunding, but or decreasing, but he wants to keep our police level what it is currently.
Right, and
So
divert some of that funding to the community. Yeah, right. The
yeah,
department.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. So I do think it's really interesting to see what is right. We have to what is the best route to one, achieve public safety, but also not over police and hurt communities as well.
Yeah, listen, and the other thing that people aren't talking about, and I had this discussion with Eric Adams at dinner 2 years ago, is I believe we have enough police in New York. I just
Yeah,
believe they're not deployed properly, and police should be there should be deterrence, and
yeah.
there should be presence in the communities. And I jokingly said in a radio show a year ago that if I were the mayor, I would require that every cop be on the beat every day, and that anybody that walks less than 15,000 steps should not get full pay that week or something like that. And I got a pretty angry one or two emails who said you. But the mayor of New York is the commander in chief of the police force. And one thing Eric told me after his first year in office was that the most surprising thing was how demoralized New York City's police force was after the de Blasio administration, and how he had to go precinct to precinct to give pep talks to the police. And they felt like they finally had a mayor who had their back. You've seen this, I've seen this, everybody's seen this. You walk into a subway station, there's five cops standing at the turnstiles on their phones or bullshitting. There's three cops standing on the street just hanging out together. That's not, our tax dollars are not being used effectively there. They should be maybe in pairs occasionally, but they should be walking the beat. They should be there as a presence like on the subways so that we deter crime as opposed to react to crime.
Hmm. Fascinating. We're running a little bit out of time, but I want to ask one more question.
Sure.
I just want to touch on education real
Yeah.
quick.
Yeah, but
And this is a more of a general policy question. As a product of New York City public schools,
as a
I guess
teacher,
we both
I was a teacher.
and a teacher, class sizes are too big. And I think it's been an issue for a while. And I think a lot of candidates in this race are trying to figure out ways to decrease the class sizes. And I think it's been an issue for years and years and years.
Let me cut you up because I know where you're going. Um, the whole debate about public education is missing one fundamental issue, and that's why public education continues every year to decline for the last 50, 60 years. I was a teacher in the public school system for 2 years. Right after I got out of graduate school, I taught at my alma mater, Stuyvesant High School, for 2 years. I became very friendly with a great teacher in my department named Frank McCord, who later became a very famous author. I learned a lot about teaching from him, and I learned a lot about the importance of great teaching from him. Class size, charter versus public, how much money we give to schools, all those things would fall by the wayside if people like you and the top quartile of your class at Cornell was attracted into teaching in public schools as opposed to go to law school, medical school, business school. We have degraded the profession of teaching so much in this country that at best the middle quartile of college graduates go into it. Now, it's a systemic problem. Teaching is one of the few professions in America, probably the only profession where there's no career ladder, right? If you are a great teacher, how can you move up? The only way you can move up is possibly becoming an assistant principal, which most of them don't want to do anyway. Um, when I ran for mayor, and I've been a consistent advocate for this, is we should treat teachers like we treat NBA players. We should go out and recruit charismatic young people like yourself in college and say, Jaiden, I know you might want to go to law school, but we've watched you in class giving lectures or speaking. We think you have potential to be a great teacher. We're going to give you a $50,000 signing bonus to become a teacher in New York. We're going to get you subsidized housing in New York. We should build housing for teachers and cops and stuff like that. And you're going to start out at $100,000 a year as a teacher. And if you become a great teacher in 10 years, you'll become a master teacher where you make $250,000 a year. Then we would be attracting the best minds in America to teaching, or some of the best minds at least. And when I was at Cornell, there were two professors that I listened to like every word. One had a class with 400 students in it, and it was on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings at I forgot where it was held, and it wasn't Bailey. And then I had another professor who had a class of 1,200 students at Bailey Hall. Also, I learned more in that class than I learned in a seminar of 20 people. So I don't think class size is really necessarily the issue. It's the quality of the person standing in front of that room. If that person is charismatic, can keep me engaged, or keep students engaged, knows how to teach the subject matter that they're supposed to teach. Frank McCourt kept his students mesmerized every day because he gave them fun assignments. He made them think differently. I watched him. I became a better teacher because of him. And I think, again, 90% of the problem with public education in America is the quality of teachers.
Mhm.
Class size, like I said before, class size, charter versus public, all the other debates people have are just sideshows, and people not don't focus on the most important thing, which is quality of teachers.
Wow. Fascinating insight. Well, thank you. I think, I know, I feel like the time
After
went by.
after I sit through these kind of videos, I'm like, why didn't I run for mayor again this year? I should have. When I ran 12 years ago, I had sat with one of the candidates at breakfast, and he was like, "You're really smart. You know a lot of education. I need you as an advisor." And I walked out of that breakfast, and I said, "You know what? I'm smarter than these guys are. Like, why don't I run for running for mayor and getting elected for mayor are two very different skill sets."
Yeah, yeah,
I was a not great candidate. I'd probably be a better one now, but I think I would have been a good mayor because I think I have ideas that would resonate.
yeah, for sure, for sure. Last lightning question. Do you anticipate Tuesday night's going to be a close election?
Yes, I think it's gonna be closer than people think. I don't think we'll know definitively who the winner is that night. I think Cuomo and Mamdani will both be in the 30s. I think Mamdani probably in the low 30s and Cuomo in the mid to high 30s. I think Lander will have taken some of Mamdani's votes in the first round and maybe a little bit of Cuomo's, so whereas Cuomo was 40 and Mamdani was like 27 or something the last time I looked. I think Lander's going to probably have, and Lander was like an 8. I think Lander probably popped up to
Mm,
15, 16. So I think, but I think, listen, if Cuomo doesn't get to 35% or more on the first round, he's going to have a hard time winning
being
that night.
ranked choice. Yeah.
Same thing with Mamdani. If Mamdani's not at like 28 to 30%, I think his chances are also going to be slim. One last thought, which is that, July 1st or 8th, or whenever we find out exactly who won the
I think
primary,
it's the first. Yeah.
well, the
There
first
may be.
they're going to start running the ranked choice sort of
Okay.
the
Okay.
runoff.
Yeah.
But I think with at least with Adams and Garcia 4 years ago, it took quite a bit till they had a
Okay.
definitive winner. So maybe July 5th or July 8th or July 10th. But that's not going to be the end of the election this year because
Yeah. This is going to go into November. Yeah.
normally the primary winner in New York is, almost definitively the winner, except, when we had Republican mayors for 20 years. But this year you've got probably 5 people in that general election.
Yeah.
You're going to Eric Adams for sure, Jim Walden for sure, Curtis Lever for sure, probably Andrew Cuomo unless he gets blown out on Tuesday night, and probably Zoran Mamdani unless he gets blown out
Same
on the.
thing. Yep.
So if you and by the way, it's not ranked choice voting in the general election. It
Yep.
is plurality. So if you get 35, 37, 38% of the vote in that 5-person field, you're likely to win.
Win. Exactly.
I can make a
Exactly.
case for any of those people except for